It's time to enhance the relationship between expertise and impact, between knowledge and application. Welcome to a journey of discovery and empowerment. Welcome to All Physicians Lead, the Forbes Books podcast that highlights the critical leadership role that all practicing physicians take on every day. Here's Dr. Leon Morse.
Welcome back to my continuing conversation with Dr. James Stoller, the chairman of the Education Institute at Cleveland Clinic. With an illustrious career spanning numerous leadership roles, groundbreaking research, and prolific writing, Dr. Stoller's accomplishments are indeed far-reaching. Now, Jamie, in part one, you called yourself an accidental leader. Following that thread, what's the best leadership advice you've ever received?
I think the issue that comes up in my mind in this transition to actually stepping into or aspiring to a leadership role, a big L leader role, is the internal reflection about one's own commitment. And I think that transition to a big L leader role is the moment in which you need to make sure you look in the mirror and can authentically say to yourself that you're in service of other people's needs and have subordinated your own needs to theirs. And the idea of authentic leadership is really based on that commitment. That, many people pursue leadership roles for a title. And as you all know in your career and I recognize in mine, the luster of a title wears off very quickly. The gilding is off the rose very quickly because there's all this transactional stuff that has to be attended to that is not necessarily the driver of one's contribution. There are many dimensions of my leadership role that are purely transactional, managing schedules and payroll and things that, frankly, I think an orangutan could be trained to do that are not part of the reason to step into a leadership role. The reason to step into this is to make a difference in service of the institution and its mission and the individuals in it. And that requires what Greenleaf has called servant leadership, the idea that I am in service of your needs rather than the other way around, which again, it requires a bit of a pivot. Most of us in our academic careers start out our careers building our own CVs, building our own credibility, building our own mastery as doctors, as investigators, as scientists, as educators. And the pivot to a big L leadership role requires a transition that's explicit and authentic and persistent. So that's the advice that I would offer.
So it's not like you don't have enough things going on right now, but if I were to ask you, what's the future project, big goals on your horizon? If you had an extra 14 hours in a day, where would you be focusing that effort?
Well, I've become more and more aware, as the conversation probably indicates, in making a contribution to developing leaders. And as I've thought more and more about that, trying to provide a rubric by which to understand great leadership, I've focused on virtue-based leadership, the 7 classic virtues: trust, compassion, hope, justice, wisdom, courage, temperance. Very much embedded, as you know, in your military experience. When one talks to the Navy SEALs, and I've talked to many, maybe the toughest humans on the planet, they talk about their work through a virtue-based lens. And so I'm very convinced that high performance, which is what we all seek in our clinical careers and our institutions seek, comes from creating cultures that are virtue-based, that leaders create culture, and healthy cultures unleash the discretionary effort in the organization. In other words, great performance doesn't come from my having a compliance mindset, my rewarding you if you do something well, my punishing you if you do something badly. We do that with our young children when they're being potty trained, perhaps, but it's really not a healthful approach to marshaling and unleashing discretionary effort in committed people like doctors and nurses and healthcare providers. In fact, what we should do in those environments is create environments that unleash discretionary effort. People will do the right thing when no one is watching. And the avenue to create those kinds of cultures comes from leaders developing cultures that are embedded in the virtues. Which one of us would not want to work for a leader or in an organization that valued compassion and trust and justice and wisdom. I've yet to see somebody sign up and raise their hand given that option. So it's incumbent upon leaders to create those cultures. And what I'm trying to do in my own thinking and writing is to try to articulate the premise upon which leaders create cultures that are virtue-based.
And I see just off your left shoulder your latest book. I'm holding that plus one of your recent works here, Exception to the Rule, and the most recent, Better Humans, Better Performance, that articulates that extremely well. I've enjoyed both of these and look forward to reading more. How do you feel like you're writing, you're putting this down, putting in incredible amounts of effort to codify your thinking and make it clear and focused like this affects your ability to teach leadership, to get the message out there? And what do you see as some of the successes and pitfalls of putting that kind of effort into the book when you could be spending your time doing other things?
Well, you're kind to ask, Leon. I've always thought, I think all of us that write find clarity in writing. That is to say that sitting down and organizing your thoughts into a manuscript or a book or a paper is the mechanism by which we iteratively get clearer on what we think and mean and how we communicate those principles. So for me, writing papers in my career, in this case, writing these two books with two fabulous colleagues, was not extra work. It is the work. It is the work of getting clear. And the clarity comes from engaging with others. Even these books were serendipitous. Two other co-authors are folks who come from very different experiences. One, Peter Ray, is a former dean of a business school, is now a senior executive at a technology company called Parker Hannifin, based in Cleveland, Ohio. And the other, Alan Culp, was a professor of theology at Baldwin Wallace University. And so the combination of our insights and crosstalk provides a clarity about the principles and also generalizability. What we've realized in our conversations and our writing is that these principles of virtue-based leadership apply across sectors. They apply in technology. They apply in athletics. They apply in medicine. They apply in manufacturing. And so there's a robustness about the principles that come from comparing notes with experts in other fields. And there's a certain amount of validation that comes from that. It's much like robustness in science comes from replicating results by multiple investigators across time. So too is it with these principles of leadership, in my view, that virtue-based cultures drive high performance in technology, in sports, in academics, in healthcare, in manufacturing. So same principles applied to different sectors. So it is the work. The writing is the work.
One of the things that we obviously know in life and in the world is that things are constantly changing. And I look back at who I was 30 years ago, a very different person now. When it comes to your ideas about leadership and how you lead, how you teach leadership, can you pick out some things that over the decades you've changed, some aha moments where you said, oh, I need to do this differently going forward for the betterment of the people I'm teaching and the patients I'm taking care of?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say the biggest pivot that's a function of my training in leadership and my own teaching in leadership is being mindful of what I call deficit-based thinking versus appreciative thinking. What do I mean by that? We are all intrinsically, as physicians, deficit-based thinkers. Someone comes to us with a clinical problem, in my case, dyspnea, in your case, a movement disorder, and each of us as seasoned clinicians has a long differential diagnosis that we navigate in service of coming up with the root cause, the etiology of the patient's symptoms, ideally in service of a solution. And that's how we're trained. And that kind of thinking has worked ever since Hippocrates, frankly, for millennia in medicine. While highly, highly effective as a clinician, deficit-based thinking is highly ineffective as a leader. There's a contrary school of thought is a notion really framed by one of my colleagues here at the Weatherhead School, David Cooperrider, called appreciative inquiry. And the idea is that thinking about a strength-based approach, when we're at our best, who are we and what are we doing and how do we make more of that? An appreciative mindset is very different than the deficit-based mindset that we are naturally in as doctors. And so part of leading for me has been an explicit attempt to be more mindful about the frame of mind that I'm in and the context in which I'm operating, so that when I'm in clinic or on service, caring for patients, it's all about being deficit-based and allowing that part of my brain to function. When I step into our medical executive committee or a committee that I'm chairing or just participating in, I literally take a huddle with myself, just as we do before a procedure, and explicitly pivot to an appreciative mindset in order to make my comments and my actions framed through an appreciative lens. And of course, trying to frame and model those behaviors for younger people becomes important. It's not unlike being a parent. Modeling behavior that you hope your children will emulate is the same as in a leadership role, demonstrating behaviors that you hope others will adopt. And so the short answer to the question is understanding the difference between being deficit-based and appreciative and being mindful and intentional about which mindset I am in which context, has been an important lesson for me over time. It's actually even changed the way I practice medicine or pick up a team. As an example, the traditional question we as all clinicians will ask in taking the chief complaint or history of present illness is, so Mrs. Jones, what brings you to see me today? And instead I've reframed my question in clinic to an appreciative one, which is to say to a patient, so Mrs. Jones, if this visit were successful beyond your wildest dreams, what would we accomplish in our time together? It just changes the equation. It changes the language of the discussion. The notion in appreciative inquiry is that words create worlds, and the way you ask a question frames the answer you get. And that's been a big learning for me.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And it makes such a difference. I certainly have. I'm sure you have too, seen the surgeon, I'll take that on our tribe, if you will, who chairs a committee or becomes a chief medical officer and is still in this staccato question response, do this mode in what's, a large group of very talented people with very different lenses based on the fact that there's a finance officer here and an HR professional there, a nurse in another spot. And the way you approach that group is ideally very different than how you would approach your resident fellow team on surgical rounds. But unfortunately, they don't do what you just described and flip that switch and say, I'm in a different environment now and I need to think differently, act differently.
I mean, the thing I would add is, again, this comes down to situational leadership, that leadership styles need to morph to the context of the specific issue. And colleagues of mine have articulated some of these styles. There's command and control, there's pace setting, but then there's coaching and vision and affinitive leadership. And, I think we all agree that leaders need all of those styles in their quiver, but need to be able to deploy the appropriate style for the appropriate context. So command and control, which is what we're talking about, is perfectly reasonable in certain contexts. If the aorta, the patient is exsanguinating, right, it's time to take control. When you're called to a code, you step to the head of a bed and there's a lot of little squiggles and it's ventricular fibrillation. You're not asking for a poll on who thinks this is atrial fibrillation versus paroxysmal SVT. It's, 300 joules now. So there are moments for command and control, but they have to be situationally appropriate. And leadership is around being attentive, situationally aware about the environment, and then being explicit about deploying which style one is deploying for the appropriate context.
Which is very difficult to do if you're not aware that these styles exist. You're not reflecting on which style you're using at the moment, and then furthermore downstream, looking back to say, was that effective and appropriate and sustainable in the long term? So that's a great point. We've all had the experience where we get letters from patients years down the road and thanking us, or in my business doing mostly pediatric work now, high school graduation photographs or college announcements. It's just a wonderful thing. When you think about your experience training leaders, training the next generation of physicians who are going to take our jobs someday and be the leaders of healthcare organizations and departments and divisions, any episodes stand out where you've said, oh my gosh, that person was in my class, or they come back to you and reflect upon what you've taught, shared, allowed them to grow into?
Well, I think we're all blessed with experiences like that. I would respond to your question simply by saying that when I think of the elements of my day, probably the highlights of those days are when junior colleagues come and knock on your door and come and just sit down and want to engage in a conversation about their careers. I often project back to the conversations I had with Richard Mathey and Gordon Snyder, when I was on the other side of the conversation. Those are moments when, you may not see the fruit of that conversation in a short timeline. It doesn't have a short gestation period, but that that through good mentorship and coaching, that you're having an impact on the way people envision their career and the contributions they want to make. I mean, the good news is for us as doctors, we're all privileged to have an impact on the patients we care for, and then in leadership roles on a broader impact, on a broader scale. And so by influencing young minds and having an favorable impact on them, you're amplifying, you're multiplying the scope of your impact. And so it's not so much the testimonials that are gratifying, although they're wonderful, of course, as much as the opportunity to do the work in real time is what I would say. Those are the highlights of my day. And I'm hoping that this conversation will have that very impact on listeners. That's the sort of impact I'd like to have.
That's awesome. And you've done that extraordinarily well. So congratulations on that for sure. You've talked about clinical medicine, your leadership responsibilities, both in terms of developing strategy and looking forward, and all of the transactional work that comes along with the leadership roles that we've experienced. When I talk to young doctors who are starting to get into those roles, they've clearly been focused on their clinical practice and building those cognitive and technical skills. They have a little bit of fear and trepidation about taking that next step, about adding something to an already full rucksack, young family, building a professional career within the field of medicine. What do you tell folks when they come to you and say, gosh, how do you do all the things that you do? How can I ever hope to be able to do all those things and still be a good doctor and still be a good parent and spouse and also be a senior leader of a clinic, a department, a hospital?
Well, I love the quote from Søren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, who said that life can only be understood backwards, but it has to be lived forwards. So
Indeed.
When I'm asked to reflect on my career, I often say that, a career is a video, not a snapshot. And that if one looks, even in retrospect, many of the changes and the contributions that we're describing have had long gestations periods over long periods of time. In fact, in some ways, I'm doing the same things today as I was 37 years ago when I first joined the Cleveland Clinic as a pulmonary doctor. On the other hand, I'm not doing some of the things today that I was doing. My clinical career has evolved. I've gotten more and more focused on certain things and know more and more about some things and less about other things in medicine and in pulmonary critical care medicine. And I'm comfortable with that. I think it's in the nature of the field and the nature of the discipline pulmonary critical care is evolving as well, becoming highly, highly differentiated at major academic medical centers. One has to embrace a certain amount of focus. What comes with that focus, however, is the opportunity to engage other challenges, leadership development being one of them. So I just try to listen carefully and reassure that there's ample space at the appropriate times in one's career. And again, this transition to leadership really requires that pivotal moment that we discussed before about the desire to give back and to be in service of others and subordinate your own interests to those of others. There are points in our career, early in our careers, when we're not prepared to do that. I was not prepared to do that early in my career. I'm sure like in yours, you wanted to be the best pediatric neurosurgeon you could be. I wanted to be the best pulmonary critical care doctor I could be. And that required an intense focus on skill building and learning and reading. And I'm doing all of those things today. I'm not suggesting that one ever achieves a plateau in those pursuits, but the learning curve is more shallow around those things, and it creates space to think about other things, which are critical to continued engagement. The whole story about career ennui is predicated on taking on new challenges and growing. And one has to grow in one's career, and institutions have to, in order to retain talent, provide opportunities for individuals to grow in their careers. Absent that, people will hop, skip, and jump to other places where they see those opportunities. And so one of the leadership obligations is to recruit and retain talent, and developing leadership for people for whom that's a passion is one of those strategies to retain and recruit talent. And so it's part of an institutional strategy as well.
And obviously it's worked well, both for you as an individual leader and for the clinic as one of the premier institutions ever in the history of medicine. So nicely done. Dr. Jamie Stoller, professor, chair, if our listeners wanted to learn more about your work and what you're doing, the books that you've written, the educational strategies that you employ, where should they go to look?
I guess the body of work in education at the Cleveland Clinic would be on the Education Institute website at the Cleveland Clinic, easily Googled. Our work in leadership, I suppose, could be found in various publications. There's a 6-part series in CHEST that I wrote in the height of the pandemic on leadership competencies, sort of unpacking many of the points we've been discussing. And of course, the 2 books that you graciously mentioned, the most recent of which is called Better Humans, Better Performance. And then reaching out. I'm happy to engage in any of your listeners that want to have a chat. Again, it's the contribution that I want to make in my career, and I'm certainly available to do so.
Well, thank you very much for that. And thank you again for spending so much time with us. We very much appreciate it. Best of luck with your future endeavors as well, Dr. Stoller.
Thank you. It was an absolute privilege and pleasure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And that will do it for another episode of All Physicians Lead. If you like the show, please take a moment to subscribe so we can notify you when new episodes drop. In addition, please take a moment to leave us a review so others can benefit from the leadership insights of all of our terrific guests. See you next time as we continue redefining physician leadership.
This has been All Physicians Lead. We can all be better leaders, and our teammates and patients will be the beneficiaries. Go to allphysicianslead.com to unlock your potential, sharpen your impact, and elevate your journey. All Physicians Lead with Dr. Leon Morse is a production of Forbes Books.